Vamos dar início a mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples, série da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, dedicada a entrevistas com grandes figuras da política, sociedade e economia. Hoje vamos falar sobre a democracia iliberal e vamos fazê-lo de uma forma a tentar explicar porque é que isto não é assim tão simples. O contexto é a União Europeia e a convidada é a cientista política Catherine de Vries, uma perita no que diz respeito às tendências e dinâmicas políticas no continente europeu. De Vries tem um cargo de direção na Universidade Bocconi, em Milão, no Departamento de Diversidade e Inclusão, e já escreveu também vários livros sobre o panorama político, económico e sociológico também na Europa. Vamos começar a conversa com ela. Está em Milão, em Itália. Catherine, great to have you on our show. Really looking forward to our conversation, our debate about the state of the European Union, focusing on democracy, how liberal or illiberal it is right now, and what are the great challenges to explain the dynamics at play. So, first of all, let's start with the basics. In your opinion, what is the state of the European Union like as we speak right now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think the question about what the state of the European Union is basically most of the time we say that the European Union is going from one crisis into the other. It's always some state of crisis. Within that, there is what some political scientists have called a bicycle theory, i.e. the direction is upwards, so it does lead often to more integration. But you can say that in the more recent history, further steps of integration, actually since the Treaty of Lisbon, have kind of stalled. So there's not been a lot of major treaty constitutional reform within the EU. However, at this moment in time, I would actually say that probably we think it's in a less of a crisis period than normal, in the sense that there's a window of opportunity. And one of the founding fathers of European integration, Jean Monnet, used to say, you know, Europe is forged in crisis. And you saw in the kind of COVID-19 pandemic that at the beginning, it looked really bleak. Border closures, a lot of internal struggles between member states. But as we moved in, you know, the end of the first wave and we got a vaccine procurement, we got the green passes or the COVID passports across the EU, actually, it looked already much better. On top of that, I think the icing on the cake was the recovery fund. And then you actually saw a quite different picture of quite a lot of unity in a time of real adversarial, or conflictual times, a lot of adversary and adversity. And you know, so I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. Normally we say there's, you know, we stumble from crisis to crisis, but at this moment in time, there seems to be a window of opportunity for perhaps even more integration in the coming years ahead.
I think as Europeans, or at least as Western Europeans, we like to think ourselves as people who live in democratic states, open democratic states. But would you agree with that if you look at the EU overall? What are the strengths and weaknesses when talking about democracy across the continent and the challenges or threats that are there as well in illiberal states?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a very important question. The EU is always seen as, let's say, a reluctant hegemon, but a kind of having soft power of through accession periods, right? Where a lot of countries, at first in Southern Europe, but also increasingly in Eastern Europe, were able to join the EU in a club of democratic nations. And I think that has also led the EU for getting a Nobel Peace Prize, right? So this idea of peaceful trading and therefore being more democratic, and the idea of a democratic peace, if you will. But in recent years, or maybe in the last decade, that's become increasingly, that relative picture of tranquility has come under fire. And that has specifically to do with, I think, one particular member state, but perhaps increasingly two, specifically that was the takeover of Hungary by Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz. It was also already a quite weak institution when you think about kind of checks and balances. And as he became the majoritarian candidate, the prime minister, he started to go on a road of democratic backsliding. He calls his own regime illiberal democracy. To be fair, some political scientists call it no longer a democracy, that it doesn't fit the criteria that we use. And there's also concerns about free and fair elections. We also have seen similar processes going on in Poland, quite recently also with politicization of the judiciary, a lot of rulings by constitutional tribunals or constitutional judges that go not in line with kind of the commitment to rule of law within the EU. So, there's still something to be said for that when you look at previous enlargements, but I think the picture is less rosy than perhaps some years ago.
Yeah, you've written obviously about Euroscepticism and also explored the European sentiment. And how would you characterize what's happening now after the unity that you refer to regarding how European states came together during COVID and the whole vaccination process and the certificate? Is the European Union stronger now than it was pre-COVID because of the disease? Is that something that it did from a positive standpoint?
No, so it looks like that when you look at public opinion, you do see that there's not initially, especially in a country like Italy, right, hard hit, also maybe in a country like Spain, quite hard hit in the first wave. You saw, especially within Italian public opinion, a kind of a story like, where's Europe, right? Where are our friends? Where are our neighbors? There were, maybe that was PR stunts, but anyway, there was support coming from China, and one felt that one was a bit left alone. I think that really changed with the recovery fund, and also, as you say, with the certificates and the vaccine rollout. Imagine a situation in which EU member states would have to bid against each other on the market for vaccines, right? I mean, that would have been a very different story. And it was also an area where kind of solidarity of stronger member states, more financially viable member states, were helping other member states. And I think that is also seen. You also see it in public opinion data when we look at solidarity and the extent to which one wants to help different countries. And I think a silver lining of that was actually that this happened against the backdrop of Brexit. So of a member state leaving the European Union, where initially we were a bit worried perhaps in Europe about that. But the silver lining has been that many other Europeans saw, economic turmoil, political turmoil in the United Kingdom, and actually started to look a little bit better from inside. The question, of course, is will that remain? But I do think that that's been a strength. However, some of the underlying things also in your question before about democracy within the European Union, about disunity between member states still remain. So there is definitely a window of opportunity where the European Union could move forward in that path of more integration that we saw in that COVID period. But there are still also quite a lot of internal struggles, and the question will be how that will play out, and also how upcoming elections will play out and have their bearing on what's possible and what's the room to maneuver in Brussels.
I'll get into Brexit in a moment, but you mentioned something quite interesting about the threat to democracy in some of the states that have had challenges with it. Do you think that a lot of the countries have become maybe a little spoiled with democracy, and they've kind of forgotten what it really means? And with so many influences, especially on digital and social media, creating more polarized opinions across the board, do you think that because of that, because of COVID being the number one news on a day-to-day basis, that there is a little bit more underlying threat to democracy because everybody's a little blasé about it and what's been happening in the backdrop of the political parties and the movements that are happening? I'm sorry if that's a little bit confusing, but...
No. I totally get what you're trying to say in terms of like, this was a stress test for democracy, right?
Yeah,
and COVID really was that. And the question is a bit, will democracy pass that stress test? So I think it's too early to tell. So I think what you saw in some member states, as I referred to already in Hungary, where there was already a path on democratic backsliding before, we actually saw that Prime Minister Orban used the pandemic actually to strike down on opposition and to actually kind of fast forward that process of more liberal policy making. So that's going on in the background. I think also many Europeans are looking at other countries in the world that are perhaps less democratic. Think of a country like China, but also a country like Singapore, where they're like, oh, maybe some of these countries are dealing with this better, although we still have to see, right? The Omicron wave is also going now in full force in Asia. So people are also going to see how Europe will evolve. But I think an interesting aspect of the pandemic has actually been, and maybe that has to do with that border closures, made immigration a less salient issue within Europe, that populist right parties or parties that are on the extreme right, where you usually see some of these at least tampering with liberal ideas of democracy, i.e. minority rights, rule of law, that they have actually been less successful. Actually, in some countries, Portugal being one of them, we've seen the return or actually quite good election showings of center-left parties and more mainstream parties. And so I think that is kind of an interesting phenomenon in the sense that is maybe in the short term, at least, seems like a strengthening of democracy. But I think some of the underlying undercurrents of discontent that I mentioned and that are there, and if immigration comes back as an issue on the agenda, we might see again some threats to democracy, or at least to liberal interpretations of democracy.
Regarding Brexit, do you think that actually, besides that initial fear that existed of the breakdown of the European Union, and with such an important country from a political and economic standpoint leaving the Union, that more could follow, there could be a domino effect? But do you think that actually it's kind of been a vaccine against Euroscepticism because of all the mess that has happened in the UK? And much of it we don't even know about that much, the effects of Brexit, because of all the conditioning around COVID.
Yeah, so I think it's quite remarkable. At the beginning, indeed, I think there was just shock, right? Shock in the United Kingdom about the results, but also in Brussels, and also maybe a bit of a lackluster approach to it with, we've seen, Eurosceptics parties doing well in elections, might they be European elections or national elections, and that put forward the worry. I do think that many, I think including the British government, were surprised with the unity on the leadership of the Brexit negotiator Barnier, and that actually a lot of other member states worked together, or at least had the Commission take over when it comes to the negotiations with the United Kingdom. I think that has led to a more stable idea also among citizens about what Brexit would do to the European Union. And that was so far not much, right? A united force against a third country. Then I think also the turmoil within the UK. So in my own work on public opinion, I often talk about benchmarks. I already mentioned it before, that people with COVID are looking at other countries. They do the same as like, I'm in the EU. Here's a country that left the EU. How is it doing? And so far, the perception of people has been that it's not doing very well. It basically wanted to get, quote unquote, Brexit done, which of course it's not done yet, by getting an internal trade border with a lot of economic ramifications. They're indeed hidden in Brexit, but it's very clear that the UK is not recovering at the same rate. So that will be playing out. However, in the long term, that also means that you don't know, right? It depends also what in Britain will happen in the long term. But I think at least in the short to medium term, we're going to probably see that a lot of people make the calculation that actually leaving the European Union is worse than remaining. But, that is not going to be an antidote. It's maybe not a vaccine. We need, your analogy of the vaccine, we might need a booster at some point, right? To remind us that, in Europe, it might have been a good deal. It really will depend on how Britain will also evolve.
Yeah. Let's move south just a little bit to France. Obviously, it's a big year there with elections. With that happening there and the Franco-German kind of disagreement on nuclear energy, what will be the future of Europe from a transition of energy standpoint? And we'll get into climate change a little bit later. But from an energy perspective, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think the energy aspect is really crucial, not just because of the Green Deal that the EU agreed to, which is contentious also in domestic politics, but on top of that, rising inflation, rising energy prices, which have to do with the geopolitical situation, especially on the Ukraine-Russian border. So there's a hot cocktail, if you will, when it comes to the energy transition, which might undercut the support or the public support for this energy transition. And I think what is really crucial in this situation is that there is this window of opportunity, especially if Macron would win the French election, that you see a kind of stable Italian government with Draghi, stable Spanish, Portuguese government. You see also a much more, let's say, moderately pro-EU government in the Netherlands and in Germany. So there is a window of opportunity to do things at the European level, but it is in jeopardy over the financial aspects that people are going to say, well, why, does this cost us a lot? Why are we doing this at this moment in time? So I think there are opportunities when you especially would allow the European Union, for example, to set up a green transition fund that it, in the same way as the recovery fund, would fund itself on the international markets and would incur that debt together so that it doesn't go on national balance sheets. So it allows actually an opportunity for member states to collectively finance that green transition without putting too much pressure on social, policy programs and payments domestically. That's possible, but of course that will require the political will.
It's interesting to see so far in the last decade the different attitude that different countries have towards climate change and how quickly they are adopting measures to possibly adapt to it. Do you think climate change and the measures that are necessary to combat it will be an integrating or disintegrating element in the future of the EU?
Difficult to say. I do think that there is a crucial kind of Achilles heel or worry that I have, and that is that we will not carry that transition over that the weight is not going to be on the shoulders of those that pollute the most and those that are actually the richest in society. So we have a potential here, because it's expensive, that actually it will reinvigorate socioeconomic inequality over different means. And you saw that already a little bit in France in the onset of the Gilets jaunes, so the yellow vest protests, which were about extra taxes on gas. So that was one of the things that led people to go to the street, which for some people in some rural areas, quite socioeconomically deprived areas, is a really big thing. So I think in terms of unity, it could stress domestic unity, so within countries, and therefore also create political instability, which would feed into the European level. So I do think we have to think very carefully about how we finance this transition and to make sure that it will be an equal transition where really also those that pollute the most or are the richest are going to carry a larger share than those that are in already difficult positions.
And it'll also be interesting to see whether the citizens themselves are willing to make sacrifices, right, for that energy transition. And then if they are told to follow a certain path, if that in itself is anti-democratic in a way, because people won't have a choice to select alternative avenues of energy. How do you see that, the kind of temperature of how citizens will react to certain changes they'll have to make, sacrifices?
So you see it, if you think in the long term, you see younger generations being much more willing to change their lives and doing a lot. And actually for them, they're impatient about the lack of activity, right? But I do think that in let's say middle age to older segments of the population, this is much more contentious. They in some ways also feel maybe that they're held responsible for something that they did, and they would have to change their lives. Maybe it's also more difficult when you're older to do that. I think there's a couple of worries I have about it. One is that if the EU takes a big role, if you take a lot of responsibility, you might also get a lot of the blame. So it would be easier than for national politicians to say, well, that was not what we wanted to do. That's what we are required to do from the EU. And therefore, the EU would become some scapegoat in this element. So that's my first worry. The second worry that I have about this particular process, it already links a little bit about what I was saying before about inequality, that the EU is putting a lot on the Green Deal and transitions, but a lot of the implications and the actual transition of this at the domestic levels have to be done in domestic politics. And then they become part and parcel of indeed people who are not happy, who are listening to political entrepreneurs who might not necessarily be telling the truth or provide misinformation. And then it leads a life of its own. So it's going to be part and parcel of that political machine. And that doesn't always mean that the efficient long-term thing to do is also going to be the electoral opportune thing to do.
And obviously, it's such a big political decision for these parties to adopt a new path forward when a lot of them, and I know you're an expert in this, the old traditional parties may have more of a challenge to adapt to this energy transition conversation and climate change than some of the new parties, the innovative parties, and some of the populist parties that have recently arisen as well. How do you see that dynamic playing through? And is there a threat, again, to democracy by having these new populist movements adopting a message of adapting to climate change as well and using that to captivate a younger audience?
Yeah, so it's interesting in the sense that there's been some research done also that actually it's not just on that populist right side, but it might also be on the left side in the sense that some people are worried that it's not going fast enough and we should actually be, doing more extreme things, right? Or doing more, dare I say, kind of top-down things in order to achieve that. So I do think it's a serious issue that many people care deeply about, either negatively, they don't want to change their lives and not pay more for it, or want it to move faster. So that is, an area where we're going to see contention. I think that your question about, newer political entrepreneurs versus the established parties didn't make their electoral fortune, if you will, on the issue of climate change. They did it on taxes and state intervention. Some of these might be linked up with climate change, but not one-to-one. Whereas you see a lot of green parties, what we also sometimes call new left parties, so cosmopolitan, very left parties, the green issue fits like a glove for them. The same with kind of populist right parties or more traditional nationalist parties. For them, climate change is that ultimate thing of elites telling the normal people what to do and actually, shaving off the cost on kind of the ordinary small citizen. It's not my language, but their type of language, right? So in that way, it fits, then it could become quite neatly to fit on that dimension, which you probably would call more cosmopolitan, more parochial, where immigration fits on, where European integration and international cooperation fits on, and also climate change. And then it will become a difficult issue to manage for mainstream parties as other issues like immigration or the EU have been in the past.
All right, we've talked quite a lot about ideological threats and challenges that the EU is facing in the near future. What about the physical challenges? Because I wanted to introduce the topic of borders, not only from a security standpoint, a military standpoint with the threat of Russia, and we've seen that, but also from borders opening back up and immigration, which has been a topic which has gone to the back burner for COVID-related reasons mainly, but will resurface, I'm guessing. So what do you think will happen to Europe's borders and the points of tension that will arise there, be it for military or other reasons?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a crucial question. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I can kind of walk through three things I think that how we can think about it. One, if we see more pushes of immigrants coming in, to the border between, for example, Spain and Morocco, or Greece and Turkey, or Poland and Belarus, where those have been the ones that have been most prominent lately, we're going to see that it will give renewed fuel to populist right parties or extreme right parties that are clearly anti-immigration. Right. And they've now had, maybe they were searching a bit for issues found it a bit difficult, and that will give them a lifeline back, and that will become part and parcel of that debate. So we're going to go back to some of the discussions that we saw earlier in the decade. Then what you are, or the previous decade, then I think what you see is that the immigration issue, as you mentioned, is also a huge policy beef for the European Union. It hasn't been able to really get a compromise on reforming the so-called Dublin criteria. So, how we deal with migrants when they come in, where do they stay, how are they going to be allocated within the EU? Super contentious politics. We saw it in 2015 among the so-called refugee crisis, or the increase of refugees coming out of Syria, for example. And, that's going to be really, really crucial. On top of that, if we see acceleration of climate change in certain parts of the world, we also might just see more regular refugee flows into European countries. So it's something that we really do need to think about. But the kind of paradoxical element of that is that Europe, or the EU as such, is quite wary of immigration, is also wanting to not seem, let's say, out of touch with people who have fears towards immigration. But we're an aging continent that actually would need a lot of labor in the future. So we also need to start thinking about how we can normalize forms of immigration and how we really also deal with that in a proper and humane way. And I think what we've seen with the kind of militarization of the use of migrants, which we saw on the Belarus-Polish border, a lot of people have been criticizing the activities of Frontex, the kind of European agency, but also of a member state like Poland and how it deals with refugees. Coming back to your earlier question about democracy, rule of law, human rights, and there the picture of the EU, or the image of the EU, is not necessarily positive. And I think that will also, really remain a big issue, and member states will have to agree on that. But it's really an issue where member states at this moment in time fundamentally disagree.
Yeah. Look, Catherine, time is running out. We're going to wrap up our conversation with some quick fire questions that we ask to all our guests. And in one sentence, I would like you to try to answer these questions, knowing that it's a challenge, okay? You could go on for quite a while, but in one sentence, what is one personality trait a good leader could really benefit from having, in your opinion?
Determination.
Okay.
I'm going to do it in one word.
Very clear. What is the biggest challenge that humanity faces right now?
Climate change. We can't live without breathing air.
If you could change one thing in the world today, what would that be?
Ooh, that's really triggered. I guess ideally, I would make sure that all countries trust each other enough in order to cooperate internationally to solve global problems.
Yeah, trust. That's a big one. What is the most important learning of your life so far and in your work?
So I think a lot of my work has been about trying to understand how people in other countries or other regions think about the same thing. I am a Northern European living in Southern Europe, and I think that's been the lesson of my life, really to be intrigued by other cultures, trying to understand them, and also, having some form of empathy for different viewpoints.
And I have to ask you this final one, since we have been talking about democracy and liberal versus illiberal democracy in Europe. What is the biggest challenge to democracy in Europe, in your opinion, over the next decade?
I think it will be the spread of misinformation that can be used by political actors that don't want democracy to survive.
That's pretty clear. I wouldn't expect anything else from a Dutch person, Catherine. Very objective, to the point. That's what I've learned from Dutch people that I've interacted with, and that was very clear. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your insight. I certainly have learned a lot, and I hope our audience has as well.
I enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best. As palavras de Catherine de Vries, uma cientista política que sabe do que fala, que nos ajudou aqui a explicar porque é que isto da democracia e da democracia iliberal não é assim tão simples. Até breve.